How many times he was leading protests or discussion groups or coming out to every single event that I would see him at, and his commitment to racial justice in this country, how important it was. You know, the media denigrates activists, and you know it going way back to what happened before World War II, to what happened in Spain. The whiting out of those who were fighting fascists, being called by the government premature anti-fascists. If only they were covered at the time for what they were doing, perhaps we would never have seen unfold what did unfold. The media are so important in covering these issues because I think the media are the most powerful institutions on earth, more powerful than any bomb, more powerful than any missile, and the Pentagon's deployed the media, which is why we have to take it back. I wrote a book with my brother called Static, and the reason we called it that, in this high-tech digital age with high-definition television and digital radio, still all we ever get is static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality, when what we need the media to give us is the dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. You know, when President Obama took office a few weeks before, I was invited on CNN when the Obamas came to Washington to meet with the Bushes. It was after the election. And they were talking about something on CNN and asked me to talk about it, but I see the Obamas walking into the White House, and I said, wait a second, I think we have to take pause here, right? Barack Hussein Obama, Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama are walking into the White House, the house they will soon reside in. She is the descendant of slaves, so their children, Malia and Sasha, are the descendants of slaves, walking into the most famous house on earth, which was built by slaves. Let's just take pause. Now, can President Obama redeem the White House? I don't think it's up to him. I think it's up to all of you and people like you all over this country. People who may have elected him, worked for him, mobilized for him, and now are taking stock and asking questions about the issues that you deeply care about, like war, like torture, or are they ending? Again, it's not up to him, it's up to all of you. 2 nights ago, I was at the University of California, Davis, and we were doing this unprecedented event where we had a Guantanamo prison guard on a panel. And on the video conference from England, in a screen like this one, we were interviewing Omar Dagays, who is a Guantanamo prisoner. And I was conducting this dialogue between Omar Dagays, who was held at Guantanamo for more than 5 years, and one of the prison guards who held him. President Obama promised, one of his very first promises when he was inaugurated was he would close Guantanamo. It is still open today. Remarkable. If the UN wants to show the Cubans a different model of governance, that our presence in Cuba is Guantanamo. But that issue of torture and where we go with it today, not so far from the White House and the eastern shore of Maryland, is where Frederick Douglass was born, right, the greatest abolitionist of all time. And he was raised in that area. He was enslaved as a youth and a teenager. He was, it might not surprise you to know, a troublesome slave. And so he was handed over to a slave breaker, a man named Edwin Covey, who was known as a slave breaker, who took the troublemakers. And he tortured Frederick Douglass, and he beat him. His property was called Mount Misery. But Frederick Douglass broke away, came north, and changed the world with the North Star newspaper. It's interesting, David Ruggles, a free black man in Connecticut, where he took refuge in his printing press, They found the media, the press, as the means of their liberation because information is power. It's why we have to support independent media in this country to cover all of the movements today, yesterday, and those in the future. That's what's going to make the difference. But Frederick Douglass, that property where he was tortured, Mount Misery, you know who owns it today? Donald Rumsfeld. He bought it as his vacation home in 2003 to be near his close friend, Vice President Dick Cheney. He was Defense Secretary at the time. And I found this incredibly hard to believe. And so we headed down to St. Michael's, Maryland to investigate. I was going with Dennis Moynihan, who edited the book with me and writes these columns every week. And we thought we've got to see with our own eyes as journalists. And we went down to St. Michael's, and as we got there, realized we have no idea where the Defense Secretary lives. We saw an organic coffee shop, and we thought, oh, they'll tell the truth. So we went inside. And they said, what would you like? I said, I'd like to know where Secretary Rumsfeld lives. They said, oh, just go out back and go down the road. You'll hit Mount Pleasant Road. Don't go down that road. And then you'll make a right and another right. And you'll hit Mount Misery Road. And you'll go down that. And he's right at the end. And so we went down the road, and we didn't go down Mount Pleasant. We went right, and then right again. It seems we couldn't go right enough. And then we eventually came to where the Secret Service vehicle was, the dark tinted windows, and we knew we had arrived. And I got out with my video camera, and I started zooming in, and as the Secret Service were zooming out. And I thought, does he recognize the significance of where he lives? And sure enough, right there, plaque in the ground, it says Mount Misery. So we headed over to an old black church. It was Sunday morning. The folks were just about to have Mass, and I went up to one of the older women. I said, what do you think of this historic place where Frederick Douglass was enslaved at Mount Misery, where he was tortured, and now Donald Rumsfeld, who represents torture, he now owns this site. And she said, I can't comment right now. We're in church. And when I was speaking in upstate New York, in Geneva, a young woman came up to me as I told that story, and she said, I'd like to bring you tomorrow morning to Mount Hope, from Mount Misery to Mount Hope, where Frederick Douglass is buried. And the next morning we went in a snowstorm at 5 in the morning before I was catching a plane, and we brushed the snow off of Frederick Douglass's tombstone. And then she took me across the cemetery in Rochester, New York. She said, one more grave site I'd like you to see. And it was the tombstone of Susan B. Anthony, who's buried next to her sister. And when I told the story at Wesleyan recently, a woman came up and said, and did you go to Susan B. Anthony's house nearby the statue that shows not generals on horseback, but Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass having tea together? They were not only allies, they were friends. He was not only an abolitionist, but a feminist, she an abolitionist as well as a women's rights leader. These are the movements that make this country great. And these are the movements that young people in their classrooms have to hear about. They don't do it alone. They don't have to. When you face these tremendous obstacles today, when we're talking about issues of war and torture, it's important we know what incredibly brave people did before, like those we're celebrating today. And then there is a path that's shown that young people can